Let's see, it's January 7th, 2013. It is the date in which the 10.5 unit test is now available. And we're just taking a little look outside here. You see outside the apartment there is no leaves on the trees, and I believe there's very little snow, although I can't really show that because there's a screen blocking the door there. So just looking outside, it's a very cloudy day, but it looks like there's a chance for some sunshine. So why don't we all make this a good day and not a, gloomy day, as it's time that we look at and we take the Unit 10 test on rock and roll. So let's do this, shall we? What, you were expecting somebody different? You think, somebody else is going to show up and teach this class. No, it's me. Of course it's me. And, in spite the fact that we've had, some kind of gloomy weather, hey, the outlook's nice. At least in Harrisburg, it's going to be almost, they said, possibly the 60s by the weekend. So you want to make sure you get all your work done so you can have a good time this weekend and enjoy the outdoor weather possibly, right? But before we can get into that, we got to look at Unit 10. And Unit 10 was on, rock and roll and, Longhorns and all that stuff and, all those really kind of interesting details. Rock and roll, it's hard to talk about in just one unit. The classical period, you might think in your mind, well, my mind says, oh, we could talk about that for an entire course. But in your mind, probably you think, a unit's probably too much, right? And you have to think about it, we're just scratching the surface of rock and roll, okay? Like we scratch the surface of, Baroque, classical, romantic, modern music, okay? And that's okay, all right? Because this is a survey. We're just trying to get you a wide variety of all these different styles of music, all these 20th century popular genres, okay? So, looking at the origin of rock and roll. Rock and roll is the combination, all right? Like many genres were in the 20th century, we have the combination of several, country music, rhythm and blues, jazz, all forming this kind of, bond to create rock and roll. It comes out of this idea of the rockabilly, okay? The Elvis Presley types, the music of the 1940s, late 40s, and going into the 50s, what will become rock and roll. And so when we look at this, we have to think about this idea of the backbeat, right? And the idea of emphasizing beats 2 and 4 in a 4/4 piece. So if we're playing, a typical piece and you're snapping along to the beat, you might have this, really even tempo, right? But after a while, you start to notice that 1 is the most important beat. And then 3 is just behind it in terms of importance. They're telling you that they want to make 2 and 4 more important. So it would be so much different sound, right? 2 and 4 are important, whereas 1 and 3 are important in most cases of popular music. So in 10.2, we looked at the lives of 3 major performing acts. We looked at Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and the Beatles. And while we can say, 10,000 things about each person, the main things that we want to keep track of. For Chuck Berry, he is a very influential 1950s rock and roll performer. He's known for the song Johnny Be Good, which was used in Back to the Future. He is, kind of a bad boy image, where we kind of get our original rock and roll bad boy image. He's incarcerated several times on crimes that either he committed or didn't commit, we don't know. But he kind of has that bad boy image. He's known for his duck walk, which, he's kind of on his, he's kind of bent and he's playing his guitar and, really interesting style. I won't do that because I'll probably break both of my knees. Elvis Presley, Mississippi born and raised, right? He is the king of rock and roll. What more can you say about him? No, I'm just kidding. he's known for kind of putting rock and roll in the limelight, you know, making big hits for many people. More of a cover guy, though. He's not really a writer. Quote from the Jimmy Buffett song, Oysters and Pearls, he said something like, you know, Elvis was the only man from Mississippi who could shake his hips and still be loved by, like, rednecks, policemen, and hippies. So, you know, go figure there. That's kind of, you know, the wide range, the wide assortment of Elvis's imagery and his popularity. And, you know, later on, you know, he breaks away from rock and roll, becomes more of a gospel guy, and that's that kind of image we have of him in these really far out suits and trying to, you know, really impress a wider population with his gospel music. Finally, we had the Beatles, and the Beatles, of course, are, you know, the most experimental band that we've had, you know, influencing people from the pop era, you know, the early era, the 62 to 66. You know, if I had the album there, I'd show you, but, oh, I have at least the 70s one. So, you know, this album that came out right here, the Beatles, this is the piano songbook. I've had this for, oh gosh, at least almost 15 years probably. So, God, that makes me feel old. Anyway, so they have two eras, you know, and we've talked about this, where they kind of that pop era, they're real clean cut, you know, they're everybody shaved, you know, right here, clearly this is from later on, because if you look at it, you know, all four of them, they have that long hair look to them, and, you know, they're growing the beards, except for Paul, who is, you know, kind of a little bit shy on his facial hair there. Where for first, they're, you know, clean-cut imagery, try to appeal to everybody, and then later on, they're kind of in that counterculture, that hippie style, in which their music wasn't as popular because it wasn't as mainstream. And, you know, that's kind of a sad thing, but they still had 27 #1 hits. And, you know, while the early stuff was very clean-cut, popular imagery, you know, very short, fast songs, little ditties, you know, the same imagery of Elvis in the 50s and Chuck Berry of the 50s. But later on, they're tired of that, right? They stop performing live in the mid-60s as well, and they go to the recording studio and try to bring in all these other ideas. They bring in classical music. They bring in folk music. Couple examples of that. There's a I believe it's a full orchestra, but it could be like a small ensemble in the song Strawberry Fields Forever, one of my favorite, you know, Strawberry Fields Forever, right? And there's that whole, you know, orchestra feel, and you get all these, you know, tone colors that you wouldn't necessarily have in a typical rock and roll sound, because all you have is guitar, bass, piano, maybe, and drums, right? So a very, you know, sterile imagery with rock and roll, whereas, you know, adding this full orchestra gives you this, you know, whole sound, this very, you know, tone color, tone imagery. The timbres are much different than a regular rock and roll song. Another example, we're talking about folk music. John Lennon is very much into folk music, and George Harrison into world music, right? He played the sitar. One example of a great John Lennon song that uses folk music and the sitar is Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, which John Lennon's playing a very folk-style guitar, and about halfway through the song, you hear George Harrison on his sitar, and it's wild. You know, who would think to take, you know, American folk music and mix it with Indian classical music, and who imagined the sound could be as wonderful as they made it to be. In 10.3, we looked at the evolution of rock and roll. And now I've talked a lot about the 50s and the 60s already, but one thing that we cannot overlook when we talk about the 1960s and rock and roll is the British invasion. In the 60s, it starts with the Beatles, then the Rolling Stones come over, the Who, the Guess Who, many bands come over in the 1960s. And American artists are really kind of overlooked for this British invasion, as they called it. You know, it was the dominance of the British on American Billboard charts. And that's fine, because they influenced us in so many ways. In the 1970s and the 1980s, I kind of have described this to you, you know, in several units as kind of the melting pot. The key word is fusion, right? The key word is the idea that we're blending styles together. You know, Leonard Skinner, take for example. Leonard Skinner, are they Southern rock? Are they rock and roll? Are they country? You know, where do you see him today? Okay, Leonard Skinner clearly most of the time is on CMT. But back in the 70s, it wasn't that kind of division. Subgenring was key. All right, so they were called Southern rock and roll, you know? In the 1980s, we start to really dive into electronics and this whole idea of, you know, having, you know, keyboards and synthesizers that can give you this sound. So pop music is dominant, right? Of course, you know, with a guy selling over 23 million records, Michael Jackson, and his Thriller album in 1982 to 83, that time period. You know, he didn't release an album until 1987. That was almost 4 or 5 years later. So that's how powerful his album was, with its pop sounds, with its synthesized sounds. Of course he used, you know, electric guitar. He had rock elements in his piece, but you listen to Thriller and it's heavily synthesized. So they have technology coming into play and being a major part of the 1980s. And I can't leave the 80s without talking about a defining factor. And it's in media. It's not necessarily a musical element, but it brought music to our everyday lives, and that was MTV. You know, into the 90s, and we have this whole idea of, you know, the punk rebellion, the grunge rebellion, and of course we can't talk about rock and roll without talking about those teeny boppers, right? The Britney Spears, the Backstreet Boys, all them people, you know, and this whole pop imagery that really got the you know, teenagers back in tune with, you know, this very generically made, you know, factory produced music. And is it good? It's up to you. I mean, for me, no. There's not enough of a story. It's very simple. I leave you with, you know, a wishing of good luck, right? Do well on this test, okay? It should be one that's enjoyable to you. Rock and roll is something that we all can relate to. We all can enjoy. Whether you love Chuck Berry's sound of the 50s, the Beatles of the 60s, you know, the fusion of the 70s, the techno of the 80s, the grunge of the 90s, or the boy bands of the 2000s. Enjoy it, okay? Make sure that this is an enjoyable test for you, okay? And do well, all right? I want you to do well. You have until the 24th to get everything done, and I know you can do it. All right, because I believe in you, and that's the main goal, right? Believe in yourself. I believe in you too. If you need help, let me know. Take care. Shaw out.